Today, we're going to be discussing the key insights from our second annual Employee Advocacy Benchmark Report. This is our on-the-ground view that brings together insights from almost 200 programs across the globe, including contributions from the likes of Cisco, Capgemini, Nissan, and Toyota, to name a few. We're going to be discussing how employee advocacy is driving revenue, how AI is being deployed without sacrificing employee voices, why measurement is more important than ever, and much more. So stick around because there are some stats in here that can and should transform the way you manage your employee advocacy program. Hello and welcome to this special episode of the Employee Advocacy and Influence podcast. I'm your host, Lewis Gray. Now, regular listeners will notice I'm flying solo today, so I don't have Elliot to keep me company and we don't have a special guest. But to be completely honest, I don't know if we would have room for either because there is just so much to unpack in this new data. But rest assured, we're going to be hearing from a number of employee advocacy program managers along the way. So, context on this episode, the data landscape around employee advocacy was pretty bare until a few years ago when we started to look under the hood of some of the world's biggest and most successful employee advocacy programs. As an example, we recently released the world's biggest employee advocacy study, which looked at 500,000 posts from employee advocates. But this new report is different. So this benchmark report is built by program managers and employee advocates alike and shows how organizations around the globe are approaching employee advocacy. 2025 felt like the year when everyone finally admitted that traditional organic social is struggling. Algorithms are obviously volatile and audiences are getting way more selective about who they actually trust, which is why the big headline from the report for me is that advocacy has moved from amplification to infrastructure. And that's such an important shift because a few years ago, advocacy was often treated like an optional extra. So little more than a distribution tactic and a way to get maybe a bit more reach out of company content. But now the programs that are performing are building structure around confidence, governance, leadership involvement, training, and measurement. Or in other words, the best programs are focused on intentionality and longevity rather than just, purely the number of shares. The report itself is in the show notes, but I've distilled it into 5 core takeaways that will hopefully give you a clearer sense of where employee advocacy is heading and why it matters more than ever. So let's get into it. Okay, so my first major takeaway is that advocacy is now a revenue driver for businesses. We often talk about this, but it seems businesses are waking up to the revenue opportunities that a program presents. So first up, let's talk about who's actually doing the heavy lifting. For years now, advocacy was seen as a marketing thing or maybe an HR thing, but the latest data actually shows a pretty major shift. So sales teams are now the most active participants, accounting for nearly 33% of all activity in employee advocacy programs. Telling me advocacy isn't just sitting on the sidelines as a brand exercise anymore. It's increasingly connected to pipeline, conversations, trust building, and commercial outcomes. One organization actually reported seeing a 64% win rate improvement when salespeople were singing from the same songbook, as they put it. We recently spoke with Topolti's Nick Martin, and he explained how his sales teams are generating revenue from LinkedIn. You have to hear this because it's one of the best employee advocacy wins I've probably ever heard.
The way I frame advocacy specifically with the sales team is this is going to help you sell. This is going to help you hit quota. It's going to help you fill your own pipeline. It's going to bring leads your way, and to the company. So it's just going to help everybody as an organization. One that's actually come to mind just while I was thinking about, while we're having this conversation is one of our sales, Circle of Excellence, our President's Club's winners, came to me and she said, Nick, I wanted to let you know that employee advocacy, the tool, the program and the content you shared helped me hit one of my biggest whales this year, one of my biggest sales, because it had been an account that was lost. It was they had said, no, not right now. We're kind of good. But she was connected with them on LinkedIn, and through the content that she continued to share from the advocacy program, at one point, the person reached back out via DM on LinkedIn and said, hey, is this true? The company does this now? Oh, this kind of changes things. And that brought them back in from her sharing a product spotlight. And all of a sudden, if a month or two later, the deal closed and it helps push her way above quota.
And now, to be clear, this doesn't mean that brand awareness has become any less important for employee advocacy. Far from it, in fact, as the number one objective for advocacy programs is still brand awareness and visibility, with 81% of respondents saying it's their main goal. But right behind that, you've got thought leadership, you've got company culture, employee engagement, and then lead generation and sales are sitting firmly in the mix. So what we're seeing is a more mature view of employee advocacy. It can do multiple jobs at once. It can strengthen the brand, support culture, and create commercial impact as well. For the CFOs listening, employee advocacy is still absolutely crushing paid media on efficiency. The majority of respondents said they're enjoying a cost per click between 25 cents and $1. You compare that to LinkedIn ads, where you're often looking at $5 to $10 per click if you're lucky, and you're seeing a huge efficiency advantage. And one thing that I really like here is that the report doesn't force a false choice between brand and revenue. Because quite often people will ask, is employee advocacy for awareness? Is it a lead generation exercise? When the answer is that it depends on how you design it. And actually, that's one of the themes that's running throughout the whole report. The strongest programs are being designed with business goals in mind from the outset, rather than trying to reverse engineer ROI later. You need to align the program goals with the wider business outcomes if you want to prove ROI and secure internal investment. Now, we have to talk about the elephant in the room, because the second big takeaway from the report is that AI use is now commonplace in employee advocacy programs. According to the report, a staggering 92% of program managers are now using AI to scale content production. Now, depending on who you're speaking to, this seems to be a bit of a point of contention. I think people automatically assume that any mention of AI in this context means providing employees with thoughtless, AI generated posts without any human input. And that's simply not the case. Anybody who's listened to the podcast previously will know this, but we've seen some amazing examples of AI guiding employees through the process of writing and structuring effective posts. And it's the assistant that some of your most credible voices, so think subject matter experts, engineers, can then use to turn their expertise into engaging content for social media. As a marketer, I struggle with writer's block from time to time, so it's pretty reasonable to assume that anybody who isn't paid to post, as marketers technically are, is going to regularly experience the same thing. So if you're encouraging your employees to post more, you ultimately have no sight on how they curate their posts currently. And the reality is that AI will likely factor into that process, which leaves you with two options. You could ignore it and hope for the best, or you can train and guide them to make it work in everyone's favor. Plus, many program managers are going to be curating content for employees to share, and part of this process typically involves writing multiple versions of the same copy to ensure that every employee can choose a version that's most suitable for them and their audience. AI basically allows program managers to scale the variety of options available. But, and this is a huge but, the important bit, the report is very clear that scale on its own isn't enough. Personalization is absolutely essential for authenticity and for impact. Probably more than ever, I'd argue. 47% of program managers have clear tone of voice guidelines that content curators need to follow when they're using AI, and 41% encourage employees to customize content with their own tone of voice. I think that last number needs to increase. Obviously, there are instances, such as in regulated industries, where there's only so much customization that can be done. But all too often, we see examples of organizations just providing employees with posts. Maybe, 500 employees all get the exact same post, and then they tell them to go ahead and share it. Personalization and unique voices are why employee advocacy thrives as a tactic. And I don't want to be blunt, but you're effectively turning your employees into walking billboards if you are just telling them, hey, here's a post, go share it. And their connections are going to clock it. If somebody who who starts posting and constantly pushing a company message when they previously weren't, and if that post sounds nothing like them, you'll smell it a mile off. And as soon as you lose authenticity and credibility, you lose impact. And again, this is where AI can be a lever to pull if it's used effectively. So Disseminate, as an example, allows users to bake their own tone of voice into our AI, which can then help them reshape a post in their tone before further editing if they want to. And hopefully they're encouraged to. The lesson from this data, though, is to use AI for the heavy lifting and don't let it be the final output. The programs that win today are not going to be the loudest, but it's going to be the ones that encourage human input and employee personalities. That's the stuff that's really thriving on social media. Personalization at the employee level is the key. And Vicky Cunningham from Officio Consulting, she's the director of marketing there. She recently joined us on the podcast and she explained this perfectly, in my opinion. Here's what she had to say.
I designated a member of my team, Ryan, to be our AI guru. And he, with a little help from this team at the outset, and then having learned the process himself, has created some custom GPTs for us. And, the first use case, like, okay, well, what would they be useful for in marketing? What would they be useful for in employee advocacy? And so it's to get over blank page syndrome. It's the hardest thing, right? You might worry about how many images to use in a post, but for a lot of people, whether it's writing an article or writing a social post, they're like, I don't know where to start. And so through this, we call it very pithily, LinkedIn Post Pro. That's what it says on the tin. It's got a series of prompts that will take a user through, well, who is it you want to talk to? What is it you want them to take away from this? Is there a key area you want to focus in on? And we'll just sort of talk them through it, and then help them to create a post, a start point. Now, obviously, we wouldn't encourage anybody to just take that and post it. We always say it's a start point. Take that, obviously fact check, but then make it your own. Give it your own personal spin, your own tone of voice. You can do that. You didn't know how to start with what you wanted to say. Now you've got the core of it down. Personalize it, tweak it, make it your own. And people love playing with that. I say playing with it. I mean, they're using it to either write a point of view or even to, if they're going to repost somebody else's post or a corporate post, using it to shape their comment that to go with it. And that's proved to be really, really successful in getting more people comfortable with using the tools, using LinkedIn, posting regularly.
Okay, so my third key takeaway, and I've basically just summarized this one, but it's that training is the biggest motivator. So this is one of my favorite findings in the whole report because it cuts through a lot of bad assumptions about employee advocacy and employee motivation. So a lot of people still think that the main problem with employee advocacy is that employees just can't be bothered or that they're not interested in posting. The assumption is that they don't want to do it, but the report tells a very interesting story, to say the least. So yes, lack of time is probably the biggest thing holding employees back. But among the most cited reasons employees don't post are company policies, privacy concerns, fear of negative feedback, and uncertainty about content. And on the program manager side, the number one challenge when encouraging employees to share is uncertainty about what content they actually can share. So the actual issue isn't usually that our employees don't care. It's more often they're not sure what to say, they don't know what's allowed, they don't know if it's worth it, and they don't know if they're going to get it wrong and look a little bit silly as a result. So if uncertainty is the barrier, then your job isn't to create more content, it's to create more confidence around posting on social media. And that's where training comes in. So when it comes to training, there's definitely progress here. So the report shows that 87% of program managers now provide some form of training, and the percentage of advocates who say they haven't received training or a social media policy has dropped from 38% to 29% year on year. The most common approach is structured training sessions followed by video tutorials, integration with onboarding, and then self-paced materials. So obviously, all of this is encouraging, but 29% is still a pretty big number. It's nearly a third of all employees saying, I'm being asked to show up online, but I haven't really been equipped to do that. So it is a gap, but it's a very fixable one. And this is also where naturally I would point people towards Disseminate's own employee advocacy certification. So if you're listening to this and thinking, we know training matters, we know it's important, but we don't have the time and we don't know where to begin, this is a very easy place to start. It's a free course for anyone to use. It's not just Disseminate customers. So I'll leave a link to that one in the show notes. My penultimate takeaway from the report is that while measurement is clearly improving, many teams just aren't proving the full value. And this is quite staggering because, generally speaking, this is where employee advocacy programs can hit a wall internally. So, the good news is that 77% of teams report tracking KPIs to monitor impact. So, most programs are measuring something. The less good news is that fewer than half of them are benchmarking against their peers. So the figure in the report, sorry, is around 44%. So a lot of teams are measuring in isolation. They know what's happening inside their own program and within their own business, but they don't necessarily know how that stacks up against the wider market or against employee advocacy benchmarks in general. And then there's the question of what they're measuring as well. The report says that results are often measured through likes, shares, and clicks, but of course, that only tells part of the story. The data makes the point that the true impact of advocacy becomes clearer when organizations also look at leads generated, cost savings, and real business outcomes. Common methods of doing this include monitoring website conversions and using things like earned media value and cost per click to prove the financial impact. Many have gone one step further and sourced anecdotal feedback from their advocates because this is the kind of thing that you just won't see in the data. It's the whale deal that we heard about earlier that closed off the back of a LinkedIn post, or the business bid opportunity that started in the comments section. That's the kind of thing that's really making an impact. And it's the kind of thing that, unless you go looking for it, unless somebody tells you about it, you won't necessarily hear about it. So-called vanity metrics obviously have a role because they show momentum, especially in the early stages of a program. There's definitely a place for them. They can also help you spot patterns so that you can identify what content's resonating with your advocates and with their audiences. But if you want budget, buy-in, and longevity, you need to connect advocacy to something the business and those who are managing the budget actually care about. I've already mentioned it, but one of the clearest stats in the whole report from a financial point of view is around cost per click. When measured, the most commonly reported average cost per click from employee advocacy is under $1. The report also says that just over 29% are seeing a cost per click under $2, while only 0.8% report a cost per click above $4. Comparing that with typical paid benchmarks at the $5 to $10 range on LinkedIn, as an example, you would be hard pressed to find a CFO who wouldn't be interested in at least hearing more. Now, of course, employee advocacy and paid social are not identical. They serve different purposes, but still, those numbers demonstrate that employee advocacy isn't just good for trust, because it can also be dramatically more efficient than paid alternatives. We have to discuss the employee side of the equation too, because 94% of employee advocates say that posting on social media has positively impacted their career. That is a huge number, and it tells us the value exchange here can actually work both ways. Better visibility for the business, and also better visibility, confidence, and opportunity for the employees themselves. And this is exactly the kind of thing that you want to include in your launch plans and wider onboarding efforts, because your colleagues need to know what's in it for them if they're going to start posting. Okay, so finally, last but by no means least, let's talk about executives and leadership involvement. We've said it before on the podcast. If you've listened, I'm sure I must sound like a broken record at this point, but the latest data proves it. Executives make employee advocacy stick. Leadership involvement has become so important, and nearly 80% of programs already involve senior executives. That is huge, especially when we think about where we were maybe 4 or 5 years ago, when employee advocacy was just seen as another marketing thing. We often talk about leadership involvement and the reach that this can drive, but in terms of wider adoption from the rest of the workforce, executive participation is essential because it drives legitimacy too. So when senior leaders are visible, employees see that advocacy isn't a new marketing thing or a side project to be forgotten about. It's something that the organization values and that the leadership team care enough about to do themselves. And if you look ahead to 2026 priorities, this becomes even clearer. So the number one thing that program managers want to do to boost advocacy engagement this year is encourage leadership involvement and support. That came out as the number one action for this year, with 75% of contributors referencing it ahead of things like providing more training and providing more resources. So Even though leadership is already involved in a lot of programs, there's still a sense that there's more to be done here. And it checks out. So, a lot of organizations have leaders who support advocacy in theory, but fewer have leaders who are consistently visible, active, and helping to sustain momentum. Similarly, some will have noticed the impact from one or two leaders' involvement, so maximizing this impact across all teams is a natural next step for many. If you want examples of what active participation can look like in practice, then Disseminate's case studies are well worth a look, so I'll link to those in the show notes. But for those of you who are maybe on the move, here's a great story from Lauren Harbury over at Broadridge. She joined us on the podcast recently and explained how Broadridge's president and their competitive streak encouraged others to get more involved with their program.
One of my favorites to talk about is just in terms of like buy-in and communication from our leaders. So we have great engagement from the president of our business and from our CMO and really the whole leadership team. And that has enabled us to do some really creative, like internal comms. So for example, when we launched the program, we sent out an email that was like a co-branded message from our president and from our CMO, introducing the program, generating excitement about it, and really encouraging people to participate. And unsurprisingly, I'm sure to all of us here, that generated a lot of positive traction, right? People want to participate when they're hearing from leaders about an opportunity. It has had so much impact just in terms of our ability to like get in front of people and really scale the program. Simply put, like if the president of the business is finding time to log into the platform himself, select post, customize his copy, and like push them out on LinkedIn, then we should all be able to find the time to do that, right? So I think that is like one really shining beacon of what is working well. I would also say like when we're doing our training calls, we're walking through the platform, we can pull up our leaderboard and you can see immediately that Chris Berry is the #1 sharer. And it always does give a little bit of boost of competition to be able to say like, hey, look who's in the #1 spot. He's actively using this. He's actively looking about and thinking about the content that we're sharing. Like, come on and participate with us. And I think having that example encourages folks to get engaged. And it also generates this like competition factor that's really fun. So, for example, at our last offsite, Chris came out and like invited people to dethrone him on the leaderboard, right? So there's some communication like from us about it. There's communication from Chris, and you can see it when you're in the platform yourself. And if you're using LinkedIn, right, like obviously I'm going to see this all the time, but he's really active and he's having great conversations. And I think that's something that helps kind of point an aspirational beacon for everybody participating.
So if I had to boil this whole report down into one takeaway, it would probably be that employee advocacy in 2026 is, for most, no longer improvised because the strongest and best performing programs are built with real intent. They're using AI, but not at the expense of authenticity. They're involving leadership, but not relying on leadership alone. They're giving employees more confidence through training, clearer guidance, and better content support. And they're getting more serious about proving impact, not just generating activity. So that's all for today. All the resources I've mentioned are in the show notes, including the report itself. I'd highly encourage you to dive into all 29 pages of it because I've only scratched the surface with this summary. So thank you very much for joining me on this solo mission today. And if you found it useful, please do like, subscribe, and maybe share it with a colleague. But thank you very much for listening.